Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Fourth Eye Podcast. This is your host, Ryan Webster. So, I guess first and foremost, a little bit of housekeeping to get started here. So, I'm thinking a little bit differently about the podcast schedule now, and I've decided more or less that I want to upload pretty much as frequently as possible whenever I get a chunk of time. With the way that my schedule is working at the moment, it is generally easier for me to sit down, once or twice per week when I have a couple of hours and just record audio or, work on the blog or whatever else I'm going to do. And so I am basically just going to podcast when something comes to mind, and what I'll try to do is I'll try to upload, like I said, pretty much as frequently as I can, I think, while not sacrificing quality. So I want to make sure that I'm still offering something that's useful and that I'm still addressing real problems and not making things up to talk about, because that doesn't do anyone any good. So on that note, without having to make up a problem, I want to talk about a very serious problem. And that is something that I'm not going to be able to deal with in a single podcast, but I want to talk about one facet of it, and that is the education system, and specifically within the education system, since it's too expansive of a topic to cover without spending 400 hours, I want to talk specifically about, I don't know if I really want to use this word, but suspend your disbelief for a moment. I want to talk a little bit about, and no, this is not an Alex Jones thing, kind of the indoctrination and the sort of brainwashing, and I think the lack of nuance and the lack of intelligent thought. And that's not me trying to call anybody stupid, but I do think that, and I'm sure many of you have had this experience, that it simply is a problem, I would argue, pretty much at every level of education. So it's a problem in preschool, and it's a problem in college at the highest levels of education, wherein we're offering people what I would consider to be inadequate mechanisms for making sense of the world. I think a lot of what we're doing now, and I'm sure many of you have seen this, and for people who are following this, I'm sure you've complained about this too, without jumping too much into the controversy of the gender problem and the sort of gender growth pains that we're having as we're trying to understand things like the transgender community and, people who are coming from a different, perspective in terms of their sexuality, with homosexuality and bisexuality and so on and so forth, and being non-binary and things like that. I realize those are different things. I realize who you want to fuck and how you identify are different things, but we're having growing pains in both of those areas, I would say. And I mean, it makes sense, because I think when you get a population that, at least in the current climate, seems to be relatively squeaky, that is actually a very, very teeny tiny percentage of the population, it becomes very difficult to make sense of from the perspective of somebody who is the standard, right? Somebody who is average, somebody who you would consider quote unquote normal. I'm going to put that in air quotes so as to not offend people who fall outside of where most people are, because my intent here is not to ostracize people who are already outside of the norm further. I'm just kind of pointing out that the reality of it, for what it's worth, is that generally somebody's biological, and really this kind of goes without saying, but someone's biological sex and who they would like to mate with and who they're sexually attracted to are generally 99% overlapping. So generally, if you're female, you're attracted to men, and generally if you're a man, you're attracted to women. And that's kind of what we expect. We know that that isn't a social construct because it's something that other animals do as well. And if you think the fact that other animals do it is somehow not actually true, but it's something that humans are overlaying on top of other animals, I would question that. I don't really have a proper response to that because I don't know how one could think that somehow humans are getting in the heads of lobsters and making them, making males choose female mates and females choose male mates. I'm not exactly sure how you think we're brainwashing them there, but I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But anyway, so coming back to education here, something that I've been concerned about is that it seems that very few people are willing to take on the problem of the education system. And I've been really trying to sort out what's going on there, why that is. And I think, without making myself sound like a fool here, I think one of the problems is that the education system is such an expansive topic that a good analogy would be, providing aid to, the starving children in other countries. If you have one kid, people's, empathetic response and willingness to donate is maximized. But if you simply add in the kid's sibling, that response and the total amount of money they're willing to donate goes down by a very surprising amount, because you're conceptualizing the problem as being larger than you can handle, and you become more and more aware of the futility of your assistance in that case, and so it becomes harder and harder for you to get, to become aroused to help in that situation. And I think the same thing is happening with school. I think when we try to talk about it, at first people think it's a simple issue. They think it's as simple as people spend too much time in history class, or not enough time in math class, or not enough time doing art. They think it's something as simple as that. And the second then you open up the discussion to much bigger things, like whether or not we're creating a kind of climate for groupthink, whether or not we're not processing ideas on the right side of the political spectrum, whether or not we are actually giving people an accurate view of the science and an accurate view of reality, rather than one that, maximizes the odds that their feelings don't get hurt, and so on and so forth, then people shut down because they haven't spent enough time thinking about this stuff, and they don't know what to say because it's obvious that it's such a huge problem. To me, though, and the reason that I'm here talking about this is because I recognize that isn't an excuse. I think the reality, and I imagine that many, well, actually, I don't know. I mean, I imagine that some percentage of you will agree with this, is that if it is the case, as it is, that the generation that's being raised now, that the generations of the future are the ones that are going to take over societies and replace the current leaders and so on and so forth in the world, and they're effectively going to decide the direction of where humans and the planet go from here on out, and how good of a job we do is mediated by our education systems and by the home environment and so on and so forth, by these early developmental things. And frankly, like the purpose of the education system, in my estimation, is frankly to be a place where people develop the skills and the tools that they need to best navigate reality and to make the best decisions that they can and to be the best people they can be. And I think if that is still the objective, if it ever was, I think we do a very poor job of that on many fronts. And as I've already illustrated, the reason that it matters is because education stands to be one of the most important systems that we have when it comes to determining the kinds of outcomes that we're going to be getting in the future. Sorry Sorry for the silence there, just taking a swig of coffee. So it becomes extremely important that we get this right, correct? I think that as a starting point makes sense. So then to address this problem briefly, and I don't want to make this video too long, because I can very easily ramble on about all the things wrong with education for hours and hours, but I want to do this in such a way where you can get bite-sized thought bubbles that if you're interested in this problem and you want to kind of work on it with me, you can sit down for 20 or 30 minutes and listen to this and kind of work through some of the ideas and hopefully get thinking yourself about some solutions here, because doing this on my own isn't going to work. I'm going to need help, and I am interested in helping to reform the education system, not just to talk about it. I think it's really important. Now, having said that, we can talk about the logistics later. I don't have any money, and I'm not a rich person's son, so it might be kind of difficult, but I'm willing to not just try, but to actually do something. And I think that's worth something. But anyway, to kind of zero in on this problem of indoctrination, I think something that's worth saying is that it's extremely harmful, whether we realize it or not, to give children a false sense of what's true, because we're pandering to their feelings and to political correctness and so on and so forth. So a perfect example is this kind of idea of the gender spectrum that a lot of people appear to be walking around with now. And it's very confusing to me, because it's fine as an idea, as something to entertain, right? There's nothing wrong with entertaining ideas. That's what we should do. The problem is that it's being touted as though it were a way of understanding reality that is on equal footing with gender binary. And the reality is that it just isn't, right? Because virtually every other animal, and it gets a little bit tricky with, let's say, fungus and flora and so on and so forth, but sticking simply to fauna and to animals, like, it just is the case that virtually every other species on this planet, humans included, because we're just apes at the end of the day, we're just smart ones, have a male-female, and the sexuality overlaps pretty much exactly with that identification, right? Like, seriously, like, bears or something, or really any other animal, raccoons and dogs and cats are not spending any time wondering whether or not they're actually male or whether they're actually female, or whether or not they should be using certain kinds of labels to describe themselves and not other ones. Now, having said all that, that is not intended to be any kind of attack on people who are having an identity crisis, right? As I've just said, I'm not Ben Shapiro. I don't think that you are mentally ill if you are, let's say, non-binary, or if you're, a trans person, etc., etc. I don't really have, I don't think it matters if I have a problem with that, but I don't, basically. But I think the point is, regardless of that population of people, it doesn't make sense for us to throw everything that effectively we understand about biology out because there is a new idea out that hurts people's feelings less. And the thing, I don't want to focus too much on the facts versus feelings thing, because I know that can become a very heated argument, because I think it's more about posturing and about fashion than it is about actual than it is actually important, right? I think it's purely a matter of temperament. Some people really care about how other people feel and others don't. I don't know where I am exactly there. I don't want people to get the sense, hearing me speak here, that I'm not compassionate. I do care about how people feel, and I do care about whether or not people like their life. That's why I'm doing this podcast and this blog. A lot of what I wish to do here is to address lifestyle design and to do the best that I can to help others to live their best possible life. And that applies to absolutely everybody, no discrimination. I think the same thing about members of ISIS and white supremacists. That doesn't mean that I want them to continue making the bad decisions that they're making. It means that I want them to make better ones. And it means that I don't want them to be shot between the eyes if we can help it. I think that there hopefully is a better way, and that we can start to figure some of these things out with our words instead of with violence. And I'm not a pacifist by any means. I just think that violence doesn't particularly get us anywhere in 99% of situations. But that's a digression from the topic at hand. But yes, I'm not saying that compassion is important here. It is. I just think it's silly to lie about science. Well, see, and I should be very clear here, the problem that I have is that if you're going to teach, and especially young children, about the sort of gender unicorn and about this idea of the gender spectrum as if it were fact, it's I don't have a problem personally, and it probably take me an hour to properly explain that. I don't have a problem personally with people being exposed to ideas, because that's how you learn and grow, by having things that go right in the face of the things that you believe and the intuitions that you have. Because I get the sense, and some people might disagree, that because of how our biology actually works, we all basically have an intuition about how gender works, how sex works, how sexuality works. And there are certain things in life that go against that, and those are things that, being people growing up in the world, we have to learn to deal with, that there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. There's going to be some people that you meet that don't fit into the usual boxes, and it's both of those people's job to try to be accommodating of the other and be adults and say, hey, I'm different, I'm non-binary, etc., etc. It would be really awesome if you could address me by this set of pronouns or whatever, and you can be an adult about that, and the other person can go, okay, great, you're outside of the norm, so I don't need to conceptualize you using these intuitions that I have about how other people are. I'm going to treat you like an individual, and I'm going to treat you with respect, and so on and so forth. Like, these are the normal rules of how we conduct ourselves. I think the problem is, and really what I want to say here, is getting to a point where we can act like adults and treat each other with some respect does not require us to lie about what the scientific consensus is about gender and sex and about biological norms. And this is basically the other point that I want to raise here. If your intuition is accurate virtually 99% of the time and inaccurate, some like fraction of 1%, which is effectively what happens, then it does not make sense to throw out that intuition, because there's probably no intuitions that are accurate 100% of the time. But many of the intuitions we have are extremely reliable. Some of them are less reliable than others, and some of them are extremely reliable in certain contexts, and some of them are just kind of okay. But the reality of it is that these intuitions are very important for our survival and thrival, and I think denying them wholesale is a very, very... I think you get into trouble when you do that. Now, should you question intuitions? Of course you should. You should question everything. That's how you grow as a person. That's how you grow intellectually. That's how you become... that's how you get closer to living your best possible life, by questioning assumptions and by questioning your intuitions. However, once again, questioning something and throwing it out wholesale are very, very different things. So, something else I want to get into, stepping out of the realm of gender and so on and so forth, is... And I think this is probably more common at the high school and at the college level than earlier on. But I think once we start to, in the classroom, step into a conversation about politics and about economics and business and so on and so forth, and these things that frankly can become very heated, I think what's happened, and this is something that people have been seeing for many, many decades, and for probably much longer. I'm sure this is something that's been happening for all of history, really, but it's something that's been articulated more recently. And basically, the way that I think about this problem, that I haven't named yet, I apologize. Basically, I think what's happening at the high school and college level is that when we step into the realm of politics, as I said, we're laying out the things that we're already doing. So we're doing the right first step, right? So we're saying, okay, here's the Western ideas that you've grown up with. I live in the States, so that's my starting position. And so we're going to start to question capitalism. We're going to start to question this sort of democratic republic system that we have. We're going to start to question the way that politics appears to us and all these different things. We're going to question the mainstream views of economics. Those are all good things. The problem is that what's offered in place of those ideas is things that you should question, that you should think about, like the planned economies and so on and so forth, the communism, the socialism, the things like that, because these ideas, and not only that, but other ideas that come up like postmodernism and so on and so forth, like these ideas have some truths in them, right? Like postmodernism offers the very important the very important realization that if you're reading something, or if you're going on throughout life, there is almost an indefinite number of interpretations for anything. Now, not all of them are equally valid, and that's also important. But it is true that you could, if you're just crazy enough, interpret anything any way you want, virtually. And that's an important thing to point out. And I think it's something that when you want to grow as a person, that you should be comfortable dealing with, and that you should be comfortable offering your honest thoughts and so on and so forth. I think the problem is, and maybe this really gets to the heart of the issue, and I haven't actually articulated this yet, so I think this is good. I'm growing as I record this podcast, which is the idea. I think the heart of the issue is that we're not taking the time to see if in 100 years, if you have the kind of systems that we have in the US, say, compared to a kind of socialistic idealist system, I think the reality of that is that the American system that we have, and it's not because I'm not a nationalist, so it's not because it's America specifically, I just think we have a fairly effective set of ideas. I think the ideas that we're practicing already will come out ahead of the socialistic system, because I think the socialistic system breaks down very quickly because it so goes against our biology and our intuitions and against how humans are wired and how animals are wired. Like, the idea that you have to work for your food is so true. It's basically a law of nature, right? It goes in with survival, it goes in with Darwinism, and so on and so forth. Like, the fact that the most competent people rise to the top of the hierarchy and have the most control is not only how it does work, it's how it has to work for things to make sense. If we just throw out competence and we just arbitrarily, and this wouldn't work anyway, but if you somehow could tyrannically, arbitrarily force people into certain positions in the hierarchy, you're going to get a system that falls apart very quickly, because then it would turn out that the people who are making these big decisions have no fucking idea what they're doing, and then because the decisions actually matter, things would fall apart and destabilize very, very quickly. And I think that's rather obvious. So these things actually have to be grounded in something real, which is competence. Now, it can't be grounded in, I have a bigger gun than you, right? That's not a very good system. Dominance and tyranny, as we know, as we can look at in other apes like chimpanzees and so on and so forth. Well, you probably don't want the tyrannical chimp or the tyrannical human leading the pack, because that never turns out well. But you do want the competent, compassionate people, the people that are the ideal human, let's say. And without digressing too much and without making listeners angry or thinking that I'm saying something that I'm not, something that's interested me a lot, and this is, if you've been paying attention, you've probably been hearing this in my words, something very interesting that Jordan Peterson specifically has been talking about. And I'm not religious, and I don't agree with everything that he says, and I agree with Sam Harris that 10% of what he says is still problematic for a reason. But I think something he's been very good about is that he's articulated that in the Christian myth, and I'm calling it a myth because regardless of what you think, that's what it is. Sorry to burst your bubble. But within this set, and I'm going to call it the metaphorical truth of Christ, let's say, he is at the top of the hierarchy. He's the ideal human. And that's why Christianity has been so powerful, is that it articulates in a way that it would be difficult for one person to do in their lifetime what the best kind of person looks like. And those are the people that rise to the top of the competence hierarchy. Now, I think that's a very interesting idea, and I think it's actually true in some sense. I think that's why something like Christianity is popular. I think it's one of the only reasons why it's popular, because, and I'm not going to get into this too much because I don't want to start this conversation right now, but I think the fact that Christ and loving your neighbor as yourself and a lot of these things that you would think would be ideal in a human are at the center of the faith, and why you could say a quote unquote good Christian practices those things, is because if you were to actually live your life based on the other terrible things that are in the book, you'd come out being a very different kind of person. But if for religious reasons you practice your life as someone who forgives and who doesn't practice those things that you know are immoral, and you try to be the best person that you can be, you come out being a better person by believing in the metaphorical truth, or by acting as if the Christian God were real, let's say. And I think that that's a very powerful idea. Now, I just want to say, and this is a small digression from the topic, I don't entirely agree with Jordan Peterson, because I think that he's wrong that you need religion to be a good person. I think his assumption is that if you act as if the Christian God is real, or if you act as if Christianity is true, that's a weird way of wording it, but that's what I'm going to say, you'll come out ahead of if you were an atheist trying to figure everything out on your own and with other people. I don't agree with that. I think that the reality is, because our biology and these lower levels of analysis are already atheistic, like atoms don't have a religion, cells don't have a religion, your arm doesn't have a religion, the lower parts of your brain aren't religious. Even though you could say it's a phenomenon that does arise out of our biology, it's something that arises at a higher level. I think that religion ultimately is grounded in our biology. And what I'm saying there is that, as people have said, and this is basically the only argument that I'm making, is that it's kind of like with the postmodernist view. When you read a book, you're not necessarily pulling the actual literal ideas that are in that book there. You're taking your own intuitions and interpretations of things, and you're actually laying that over the text, and you're reading it with your own pair of glasses on, with your own lens on. And I think you're doing that with the world all the time. And I think what Jordan, and I know he's not stupid, I know he's probably noticed this, I don't know how he's thinking about it, but I think what he's not appreciating is that people are actually making decisions without religion all the time, right? Like, people are making decisions because of the way that the universe is structured, because of the chemical processes that are going off in their body, because of their biology, because of the state that the universe is in as I'm speaking right now, is the reason that I'm speaking and saying the words that I'm saying right now. Not for any other reason, right? And there can't be anything religious about the state that the universe is in, and so it doesn't make sense to attribute somebody being a good person to their belief in religion, because they are overlaying the person that they are at a biological level on top of the religious text, which is why everybody has their own version of God. Now, anyway, without digressing too much further, because I don't really want to go down that rabbit hole, that is very relevant to education, because the problem is that one of the intuitions that people don't have is that they have to constantly be fighting against their own confirmation bias. And this is why a conversation about intuition is so important, because what's happening is that we're teaching postmodernism, we're teaching socialism, and there's some truth in there, and people notice that. And a lot of it is rooted in trying to be compassionate, and people notice that. And so they go, okay, well, if I believe in these ideas, I'm a morally superior human. And so now I get to victimize the oppressive Western ideas that are causing debt slaves and causing people to work in cubicles and so on and so forth, not realizing, as I was saying before, because they haven't done the counterfactual, they haven't taken the time to contrast the systems that we have laid out in America already versus these systems that have been tried in other places, and seeing how they would actually play out. They think they're morally superior because they haven't taken the time to think about the actual outcomes of these ideas if they were actually played out in the world. And that's a really big deal, because again, the reason why science done well is so important, the reason why it matters that there be tons of quality evidence and quality research behind every theory, is that it actually matters that we really understand reality, because the closer we get to understanding reality, the better the choices that we make, or that we can make. And the more distorted a view of reality we get, generally speaking, the closer we get to making very poor decisions. And I think the pushback to that, and again, this is relevant when you talk about something like metaphorical truth, if you're familiar with the idea, an example of it would be like, all guns are loaded, right? So you know, in a literal sense, that if you just watched your friend make sure a gun wasn't loaded, that it actually isn't loaded. But even so, you're still going to make sure that it's not loaded, because it's a kind of standard operating procedure that, if practiced, keeps you safe, and keeps your children safe, and keeps other people, etc., etc. So you come out ahead by acting as if it were true, right? The difference, and this is very, very important, is that there is a difference between behaving as if something is true, or having a standard operating procedure that keeps you safe, and believing that something actually is literally true. And this is something that's been lost with religion. And again, I don't want to get too much into this topic, but I kind of feel obligated to now, and I'm going to end up back in Jordan Peterson's realm for a minute. I think the problem with his views ultimately, and this does plug back into education, so forgive me, is that Jordan Peterson is someone who believes in Christianity as though it were a metaphorical truth. And the problem is that I don't think most people do that. So he is giving people a license who believe that God is literally there, that God, and actually, without even going down that rabbit hole, the reason this is important is because, take something like God, for instance, and I do think this is worth saying, so I'm sorry if I offend anybody, but if you're really convinced that God is real, as many people are, and you believe you have good evidence for that, let's say, if you're wrong about that, that actually matters, right? Because God is something that plugs into basically every aspect of your life. And you might interpret, and you might be right, that believing in God makes you a better person and that you live a better life. And if that's true, then I don't have anything to say to you. It's the guns are all loaded metaphorical truth. It means you've come out ahead by being religious. The problem is that I think that there are many people that that's not true for. And believing in God and believing in other superstitions like ghosts and any number of other things, or believing that there's some spooky element to the universe, I think makes some people's lives, as it did mine. Not that I was ever truly a religious person, but when I was younger, I used to worry about these things because that's what my family believed in. They were a little bit superstitious. And to me, it made my life 1,000 times more complicated than it needed to be, because I was worried about demons, I was worried about hell, I was worried about ghosts, I was worried about being not a good little Christian, but I was concerned about thought crimes. Like, if I had the wrong thought, am I on the big bearded man's naughty list now? And that was a real problem for me. And to me, I think this is actually, and I know I've kind of gone off topic here, but I think this actually plugs in and is relevant to the education system, because we're not recognizing that there is a real advantage in life to being rational and to believing in things that you have a good reason to believe in so that you can make the right decisions. We are equipping children and adults and people with very, very weird ways of navigating in the world and interpreting the world and making sense of things, because we don't care enough about whether or not our systems that we're giving them are grounded in something real, and whether or not they're going to lead to good outcomes, and whether or not they're even true. And I think that's a serious problem. And so I guess the thing that I'd like to get into is, well, how do we remedy that? What is the solution? Well, I don't think it's easy. And again, I think this is why there aren't enough people talking about this, because I think the solution isn't as simple as a speech or waving a magic wand and getting everybody to be on the same page. I think we have to have a lot of difficult conversations with people where we open up minds and eyes and we explain to people that, well, what needs to happen basically is that we have to get people to care about whether or not something is fact. We have to get people to start reading the research, and we have to get people to be very, very good at determining whether or not research was good science or bad science. We need people to be equipped with the knowledge of what good science is, what makes a good idea, what things are worth spending your time on, and how you figure that out. Those are the kinds of ideas that we need to be teaching in school, and I don't think it's optional. I think regardless of how long you spend in math class or history class, et cetera, and all of those other things that are laid on top of the basic foundation of having the tools that you need to be able to make sense of the world is not that important. Like, so this is something that I kind of want to leave you with as food for thought, since this video has already run on for quite a while. And of course I did end up digressing quite a bit from the topic, but I think those other things are relevant. So the question I would, or not even the question, but the thing that I would lay out is that I think the thing that we have to focus on with the education system, and this is true pretty much for any system that we want to reform, is first we have to come together as a group. We have to come together as a society, and that means people of completely diverse positions, whether they're on the right or on the left, or just whether they're somewhere, regardless of what they are, regardless of what positions they hold in other areas. We need to be able to come together as a goddamn species and figure out what we care about. Because until we do that, we can't figure out where the hell we need to go and what the best way to get there is, right? It kind of is like that quote, you know, it's like, if you, I don't remember exactly how it goes, but effectively, like, you know, if you don't have any plan and you're just walking, right, you know, you're going to end up nowhere. You're not going to end up in the place that you need to be, because you haven't established a destination. And I think that's exactly the state they're in the school. I don't think that we can even have a discussion about all of the other things, as I was saying before, that you can lay on top of that, because really, I don't think if we ever did have the conversation about what we care about, we haven't had it in a long time. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to come together and we have to decide what's our goal. Now, for me, and my answer to that question is, I think our goal is to give people the best possible, or give people access to the tools that they need to potentially have the best chance to live their best life. That would be my goal. I think it's actually something that we can really drill down on. And you might say, well, that's not specific enough or whatever, but I think it's really one of the only goals worth having, because what is life about if it's not about being the best that you can be? Like, what the hell else should it be about? And so, because I think it is so important, and because I think everybody will prosper if we start to move towards that goal, I think even if it's hard to arrange a system that helps us do that, or that helps us get to that goal, I think it's absolutely worth doing. So I will leave the podcast there for today, and definitely we'll be doing more podcasts like this where I dig into education, and there's so many different things we can talk about, but I definitely just want to leave it there with the proposition of, you know, leave comments, leave your thoughts about this podcast, and, you know, what are your thoughts? What do you think? You know, what are your answers to some of these questions? How are you conceptualizing this? Do you think we need to come together and figure out what we care about? And if you agree with that, what do you think we should care about? I'm interested to hear, and I will be looking out for your feedback. So anyway, thank you guys so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.